Hi, everybody. I know we're just letting people into the room right now, so that'll take just a moment. I'm thinking that while we wait, you might want to put something in the chat. Maybe tell us where you're from, who's with us today. Maybe there's a fun fact about you want to share. I know we've got Ben and Christy on the outside, and they can do that to kind of get that ball rolling a little bit. I don't think I can do it and talk at the same time. So if you don't know me, I'm Wendy Underhill, Director of Elections and Redistricting at NCSL. Glad to have you here. And I'm waiting for the go signal to start the real presentation. Oh, good. We've got Heather. Oh my goodness. Hi, Heather from New Mexico. Great. Oh, and Joanne. Nice. Michigan. Okay, we've got north to south. Let's see if we can get, and now we've got west. We got east coast there. Pennsylvania, we've got it north, south, east, west. We've got the whole nation covered. Whoa, that was kind of cool, the first 4 people. So Shannon, are you ready for me to get going? Hey, Tom and Grant, also from Pennsylvania. This is great. All right. I'm going to say that this is good enough. Let's just do it. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is NCSL's 2021 Legislative Action on Elections webinar. In previous years, we've done the wrap up into January, so I'm delighted to have it for you here in December. In fact, the genesis for today's event came in December of 2020, if you can believe it. It wasn't but a hot minute after the 2020 elections were over that reporters started asking us, what are states going to be doing in 2021 relating to election policy? And soon thereafter, we started hearing from our members, legislators, legislative staff, in case anyone forgets, NCSL works for legislative staff as well as legislators. And those folks were asking, what are other states contemplating this year that might be of interest to us as well? So back then, December, we didn't really have good answers. We couldn't see what was going to get introduced. And even in January and February, it was really hard to keep track of the volume of bills coming through and the significance of those. So we weren't very good at being able to wrap it up. And in fact, we were so not good at it that in March, we produced an issue of the Canvas, our elections newsletter, and we called it Primary Changes, the Hot Trend for 2021. Well, we could not have been more wrong. That was not a big topic in 2021 at all. So by April, we decided that we needed to do something other than put the bills as they came into our elections legislation database. We were certainly doing that, and we put in 2,000 bills by the time April came along. But we decided a separate tracker for just the enactments was in order. So we've got that going and started then and have continued and improved it as we go. You'll see that it's got categories in it, and inside of those categories, there's subcategories. So then June of 2020 came along, and by then we were finally ready to sort of say, what are the areas that are getting the most attention? What are the trends of the year? And I'm pleased to say that what we were identifying in June are still pretty much the trends. So my colleague, Mandy Zock, has the details on all of this, and we're going to turn to her shortly. And her presentation will be just in the NCSL mold, nonpartisan, straightforward, just the facts kind of presentation. Before we get there, I do want to say if you've got questions, by all means, put them in the Q&A, and anything else you want to say, the chat is available to you as well. And Mandy, I am going to go through those first 3 slides on my own before I turn over to you. These are overviews, kind of help set the stage. So let's go to the next one. Here you can see that the number of enactments and bills from last year. And the big news is that we had a huge number of bills introduced. 3,676 is what our database says today. And that is by far a record since we began tracking this information in 2001. But what's not a record is the number of enactments. We're at 285 this year. So to put these numbers in perspective, on the left chart, you'll see the number of introductions. These are in odd numbered years so that there's good comparison from 2011 to now. And for the first half of the last decade, there were approximately 2,500 bills each year. That number took off in 2019, as you can see, and then we set that record in 2021. And what you can't tell by just the numbers of bills is that this year we had quite a few omnibus bills. Those are great big bills that wrapped up a bunch of policy changes all in one fell swoop. But then on the right, when you're looking at the enactments, these are, of course, bills that made it all the way through the legislature and got signed into law. That number stayed in the same ballpark as the previous years in this last decade. Now, 300 bills plus or minus, we're at 285 right now. So what do we make of this? My common sense answer is that the 2020 election brought far more attention to election administration than we'd ever seen before, accounting for the increased number of introductions. But there's still only so much time in a legislative session. And this year, there were some other priorities, like dealing with COVID-19, both from a health perspective and an economic or workforce perspective. So my thought is that we got what we got, and we may see more of this in the coming year. And let's just take a look at the map of where these bills came from. We had enactments in 42 states and 2 territories. And there were introductions in all 50 states and all territories. The only exceptions were the Northern Mariana Islands and American Samoa. And just yesterday, Mandy and I were thinking maybe we don't have the right mechanism for catching those bills. So we're going to be looking into that as well. I was a little surprised that the number was 42 states and not a little higher than that. So I looked at vetoes. And we did have 27 vetoes this year. Those came in 10 states, and 2 of those states were Pennsylvania and Michigan. So without vetoes, these states would have been colored in too. And I think let's take one more slide, Mandy. And this one relates to how voters make their choices about how to vote. We borrowed this slide from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. And the blue line shows people who vote in person on election day. Of course, if you went back before 1996, that would have been an even higher number. And you can see that the number of people voting on election day has been on a downward trend for the full 2 decades. And then the green line, that represents the people who voted in person, but during an early voting period before election day. Now, of course, states had to permit them to be able to vote in an early voting period before election day. So if that's not permitted, then of course people aren't taking advantage of that option. In 1996, there were only 3% of all voters who were doing that. And then the red line, that shows the people who were voting on an absentee or a mail ballot. That was 8% of people in 1996. You can think of traditional fashion absentee voting. I'm not going to be home. May I get a ballot, please? And that was at 21% in the year 2018. So there was quite an increase, kind of steady increase for 2 decades. Then COVID changed everything. And in 2020, 46% of all voters used an absentee or mail ballot. So I guess the point is that policy matters a lot, but also voters are making choices. And this represents both of those things together. Mandy, it's your turn, but for those of you who know us, we often like to ask our presenters some kind of fun question about themselves. So your question today, Mandy, so we get to know you a little bit, is what was your first job?
So my first job, I'll go with after college because it's a little more interesting, was actually working at a dance studio. I was the studio manager and I taught tap and ballet classes to preschool through middle schoolers. I don't think you knew that, Wendy. So
I did not know that. And I know
fun
you're pretty
fact.
well, so that's cool.
Right. Wendy, do you have a fun fact to share for us as well? What was your first job?
So my first job after babysitting, that doesn't really count, was at the condominium complex where my family lived. And I got hired onto the grounds crew. And I was the only girl on the crew, so that meant I had to pick up the dog poop. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's what I did in high school. 2 years of it, in fact.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, okay, so, it's fun.
I think
anyway.
I'll dive in then to kind of the start of the voter experience, which is voter registration. Oops, I went too far. So there were a handful of enactments relating to how and when eligible voters can register, but also nothing that really amounts to a full-on trend. As you can see on this slide, single states made policy choices, but we didn't see a handful of states make the same policy choice. Automatic voter registration did see the most action though, so a handful of states either updated or expanded their existing AVR programs. That was like California and Nevada. But the biggest news was that Delaware enacted AVR. So now 21 states in DC have automatic voter registration through state agencies like the DMV. In the Northeast, Maine also made a big change and passed online voter registration, making it the 42nd state to do so. So that has been a trend over time. And also notable was Montana's enactment repealing Election Day registration. So 18 states allow voters to register and vote on Election Day. And then in Montana, the deadline to register will now be the day before Election Day. And then lastly, in Virginia, 16-year-olds are now allowed to pre-register to vote. So after a voter registers, the next policy choice that many of them encounter is voter ID. And action here has been down over the past few years, but this year it really came roaring back. Wyoming enacted the state's very first voter ID law, bringing the total number of states with voter ID laws to 35. And then Arkansas and Montana also both made their voter ID laws more strict. So states without voter ID laws will verify a voter's identity through other means, but voters in some of those states might actually be seeing voter ID questions on their ballots soon, whether that's through a citizen initiative or a legislatively referred ballot measure. There are campaigns underway in Nebraska and Pennsylvania and possibly others seeking to have voters make the choice about whether or not to implement voter ID laws. Another topic that got a lot of attention this year was early in-person voting. So in a big bipartisan effort, Kentucky added 3 days of early in-person voting for the first time, and that brought the total number of states with early in-person voting to 43. Indiana, Louisiana, and Oklahoma all also extended early voting days. Iowa decreased the number of days from 29 to 20, though I will add that 20 is still around average for the nation. And then Georgia standardized the number of days across the state. Some states also limited the types of early in-person voting offered. So Texas prohibited most overnight voting and drive-through voting. And then Georgia limited the use of mobile voting centers to declared emergencies only.
Well, that's a good stopping point, I think, before we get on to kind of the big topic, which is all about mail voting. So I just want to say that all of those things you've just talked about have been hot for the whole time I've been here, which is 11 years. When I arrived in 2011, voter ID was the only topic anybody seemed to want to talk about. And by the middle of the decade, everything related to registration had sort of taken over, and there were quite a few different things, and early voting was throughout. So I love the fact that things are not like toggle, yes, no. There's a way to see them shift over time for the whole nation. So thanks for that. And now jump into the stuff that's a little more right this year.
Right. So unsurprisingly, absentee and mail voting, like Wendy said, that was really the biggest topic of the year. And I will just add that NTSL really defines all mail elections as those where registered voters automatically receive a ballot in the mail. So prior to 2021, 5 states used all mail elections, and they're in green on this map. And then this year, California, Nevada, and Vermont added it. So they're also in green, and they have the dark borders around them. So now we have a total of 8 states that will run elections primarily by mail, though all do retain in-person voting options for those who either need or prefer it. And the dark blue states on this map are those with no excuse absentee voting. So where a voter can request an absentee or mail ballot, states call them different things, without needing to provide an excuse. We didn't actually see any states add no excuse absentee voting this year. So an attempt failed on the ballot in New York, and we also didn't see any states remove it. So even though no states drastically expanded or limited access to absentee voting, many states did turn their attention to their absentee mail voting processes. And that did result in a lot of legislation focused on fine-tuning the process. In particular, we saw several enactments addressing when ballots must be returned. The most common deadline for an absentee ballot to be returned is Election Day, and that's the case in 35 states. That number now includes New York, which this year moved its return deadline from the day before Election Day to Election Day. So most states don't accept ballots after Election Day, but 16 will if the return ballot was postmarked on or prior to Election Day. There were 2 changes this year, and they both went in opposite directions. So Iowa removed its postmark by provision, and then Oregon created one. And then I'll also add that at least 6 states make exceptions for military and overseas voters because their ballots have to travel much further distances than a domestic voter. And those laws typically give an additional 7 to 10 days for a ballot to arrive and be counted, as long as it has been postmarked by election day. So here are a couple other hot topics in the absentee ballot world. Ballot collection, also known to some as ballot harvesting, was a contentious issue even before 2020, and that concerns who can return a ballot other than the voter themselves. So with the recent increase in absentee mail voting fueled by COVID, this issue really came to the forefront of some legislators' minds. 43 states have some kind of limit on ballot collection, either in terms of the number of ballots that can be returned by someone other than the voter, or who can return someone else's ballot. Most states will limit or restrict ballot collection to family members, household members, or caregivers. And then this year, at least 3 states made their ballot collection laws more strict: Iowa, Kentucky, and Montana. Closely related to ballot collection laws or ballot drop box laws, these were not really an issue in legislatures until this year. So up until 2020, only 8 states made mention of drop boxes in statute at all, and the statutes almost entirely address security features. This year, 9 states enacted bills related to drop boxes. So many of those bills still address security features, things like 24-hour cameras, but for the first time, we saw enactments addressing how many drop boxes are either required, allowed, permitted, and then where those drop boxes should be located. So ballot tracking, at least 34 states have ballot tracking systems. Some of these are established in law, some are established without. And these systems allow both voters and election officials to know where their ballots are. So that can mean peace of mind for the voter and also potentially greater efficiency for election officials. This year, 3 states, Iowa, Texas, and Utah, passed legislation establishing ballot tracking systems. And ballot curing. So once those mail ballots are in, sometimes we find that election officials will find that a signature is missing or it doesn't match. In states with ballot cure processes, those issues can be fixed and they can help identify if someone other than the voter signed a ballot. So prior to 2021, 18 states provided voters a chance to cure their ballots. And then this year, 5 states enacted cure processes, bringing the total to 23. Unlike many of the other changes we saw this year, signature cures were passed in both red and blue states, as you can see: Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, Virginia, and Vermont. So that's what I have to say about the voters' side of elections. And before I move on to what is a cornucopia of other topics, I think we can pause here for a question or two. Do you have some for me, Wendy?
Well, I'm going to start with a comment and then I'm going to ask Heather's question, but I'm going to ask Heather's question of everybody who's in the audience, because it's a little, so if everybody could go to their chat, read what Heather put in, you might be able to have some answers for us. But the thing I want to say, Mandy, is that what I think I'm hearing you say is that there were a lot of details related to absentee voting, and that the focus wasn't on yes or no, have it or don't have it. It was on the details of how we're running it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm seeing kind of a nod on that. And would you say that these things that you've done, the deadlines, the collection, the drop boxes, the tracking, the curing, are these good for voters, or are they good for administrators, or are they good for security? Is there a way to wrap that all up?
I think it's good for all of that in general, right? If you think about something like cures or tracking processes, that helps the voter know that their ballot was received. It helps them know that there's this secure process that the ballot goes through, but it's also really helpful for election officials knowing where the ballots are that's out, and making sure that if they get a signature that looks kind of wonky, they have a process for confirming whether or not it was the voter's signature, instead of just canceling the ballot or rejecting the ballot. Sometimes someone has had a stroke or broke their arm, and so sometimes there are reasons for an unusual looking signature. And so all of these things actually build security into the process for election officials.
Great. I really appreciate that. So Heather's question was about reforms that could both engage voters, and I think that we could make that more concrete by increase voter turnout, and also inspire confidence in outcomes. Heather, I'm going to just hold that to the end and let everybody percolate on that a little bit. I think that's kind of, you've hit the nugget of exactly what is on everybody's minds. We want everyone to vote, but we also want to be sure that the elections are well run. So, okay, you've got a whole cornucopia of other things, I think, ready to go. Mandy, just go right forward.
Well, and I'll just add to Heather's question that communication about some of these processes that states have, like a signature cure process or ballot cure process, tracking systems, just knowing about it, knowing how it works, that kind of communication and transparency is potentially helpful, but that's not necessarily something that can be legislated. So I will move on now to funding elections, a big topic. So these don't all fit into the same neat bucket that the other slides do. The first one, though, like I said, it's a big one. Prohibiting private or charitable funding for elections. So before 2020, no organizations were making gifts, grants, or contributions of any kind to election offices. And COVID changed that. The Center for Tech and Civic Life, with money provided by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, responded by providing COVID-19 response grants to election jurisdictions. And then some states reacted to that. So far, I should say, 11 states have enacted bills either limiting or prohibiting the use of private or philanthropic funding to run elections. And this was all over the news. And I would say it's kind of rare that we see 11 states make the same policy choice in the same year. So this was a really big trend this year. Wendy, do you have any thoughts to add on this?
Well, it's such a great big deal that it kind of brought to the attention of the press, legislators, the public, that elections might be priceless, but they do cost a lot of money. And so if we're not taking this one-time only money to keep local election officials open, which is indeed a policy question that really does need to be vetted at the legislative level, then the question is, where will the funding come from? And we know that local counties and local jurisdictions are the ones who pay the most to run elections. There's these occasional and hard to predict infusions of money from the feds. And of course, states are glad to have the feds help out, but it's hard to budget around that when it's kind of a mixed bag of when are we going to get it and how much are we going to get and what are the strings going to be tied to it. So I do think that there's likely to be more attention paid in the legislative bodies going into the future about what mix is appropriate between local, state, and federal. So we'll find out. As you know, I'm not that great a predictor of what's coming, but I'm predicting that.
I would predict that as well. So another big trend this year was a new focus on election officials. We know that many faced harassment and an unwelcome spotlight in 2020 and 2021. And of course, some of that attention translated into this year's legislation. So first, a handful of states created new penalties for local election officials. And I will add that firing an election official who doesn't follow state law has always been an option. But now 4 states have gotten more specific. And then mis and disinformation was also an issue that greatly affected election officials. And Arizona, Kansas, and Louisiana all passed bills making it a crime to impersonate an election official. A handful of states also passed legislation adjusting or creating new training requirements for election workers. So that could include election officials, but also poll workers or the volunteers who help make elections run.
And on that, I'd like to just add too that legislators know what it's like to be harassed and to be threatened. And now local election officials know that too. There's been a fair amount of press. There was a good Reuters article about this recently. All across the nation, in blue states and in red states, local election officials and state election officials have been put under a lot of pressure from threats and harassment. We haven't seen much on that legislatively. There was one bill that did not pass, which is why it didn't make it onto the slide, from Washington state that addressed this and tried to give some additional protections. And so another prediction I'm going to offer, again, knowing I don't have a crystal ball, is that we might see that move forward in Washington, and possibly other states would be looking at something similar to that.
So another policy trend this year were audits, post-election audits. And the term audit has come up a lot in conversations about election integrity. And so when NCSL talks about audits, we mean statutorily mandated post-election tabulation audits, which are audits that verify the accuracy of an election's vote tally and have procedures for the audit clearly defined in state law before an election. So most states use a traditional fixed percentage audit where the same number of ballots are audited, whether the race was won by a mile or is a nail biter. But over the last few years, there has been a trend toward risk limiting audits, which are statistically based audits that decrease the number of ballots to be audited, while also providing statistical confidence that the election result is correct. So now, as you can see on this map, 15 states either use risk limiting audits, have a pilot program, or make them optional. This year, we saw 5 states take legislative action on post-election audits, and you'll notice this is another area where both red and blue states often move in the same direction. So Kentucky and Texas, for example, both established pilot programs for risk limiting audits, and Nevada made some adjustments to its program, which was implemented in 2019. Alabama's legislation or enactment will allow a post-election audit of 3 counties in 2022. It's not called a pilot, but it kind of looks like it, and it will allow HAVA funds to be used for those audits. And then in New Hampshire, legislators passed a bill establishing a committee to study post-election audit counting devices. So we might see additional action in that state soon. And the next subject is cybersecurity. And I'm actually going to hand this one over to Wendy since she's the real cybersecurity expert here, or at least between the two of us.
Well, I guess thanks on that, but clearly nobody's a true expert on cybersecurity. And I feel like even the cybersecurity specialists aren't necessarily always able to be up to date on that. So what Mandy's done is she's shown you what this year's legislatures were doing. And the key point is that you can't write a bill that says we will now have cyber secure elections. That's not possible. You have to be more specific about it. You have to put some meat on the bones, be really clear about it. And I would say that for the last several years, it probably goes back to 2015, cybersecurity has been hard for people to figure out what are they going to do. So we've got the ideas from today, but there have been ideas from states in the past that are still good ones. And the one I wanted to mention is there's a position that can be created in a state called a cyber navigator. And this was first created in Illinois through legislation, and I'm going to say it was 2017, might have been 2018. And that creates a state job, maybe out of the Secretary of State's office or something similar, where they can go out to the local jurisdictions and help the local election officials understand what the potentially complex instructions that they're getting from the Department of Homeland Security, from the FBI, from their state's chief information officer, and bring it right down to things that it is that states can do. So it's kind of a teach the teacher kind of a thing. Maybe that's a good analogy, maybe it's not. I just wanted to point out that cybersecurity has been around for several years as an issue, will be around for years into the future, and there's not one model at all. It's kind of fun to look around and see what various states are doing.
All right. Well, I have 2 more slides then. So this next one captures a few other election trends and notable enactments from this year. So the first is ranked choice voting, and I saw that someone asked about that in the chat. Just so that we're all on the same page, ranked choice voting, also known as RCV, is when voters rank all of the candidates for a given office in order of preference. And to win, a candidate must receive a majority of votes, not just a plurality. So there's been increased interest in this voting system from both sides of the aisle. And this year we saw 4 pro-RCV bills pass. Colorado and Utah both enacted bills relating to using RCV in local elections. Georgia made provisions for military and overseas voters to use RCV, they sometimes call it instant runoff voting, in the state's primary runoff elections. And that's not uncommon in the South in states with runoffs. And then Maine, the first state to make widespread use of RCV, passed a housekeeping bill clarifying the procedures for RCV in presidential primaries and general elections. Poll workers and watchers were also a hot topic, especially in the news, but we did see 13 enactments in 11 states. Some of these were related to training, as I mentioned on the election officials slide, but several others were in response to poll worker shortages and will now allow poll workers to work in precincts where they're not registered, to serve in adjoining counties and other adjustments like that, just to make the pool for poll workers larger. There was also a flurry of enactments on voter list maintenance with 19 enactments in 14 states. And this includes changes to how deceased people are removed from lists, allowing or requiring a state to join ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, and making provisions for some voters to keep their registration information private, such as victims of domestic violence. And lastly, 3 states made big changes to felon voting rights. Connecticut, New York, and Washington all restored voting rights to citizens on parole, becoming the 19th, 20th, and 21st states to do so. And my last slide is a look at what didn't happen this year. Wendy alluded to some at the beginning of our presentation, but we also just thought it would be interesting in general to think about what people were worried about or thinking about or discussing early in 2021 and what didn't come to pass. So first, changes to the Electoral College. There were a lot of introductions on this. We wrote about it in the June issue of the Canvas, our monthly newsletter, but none actually translated into enactments. So no state switched to the congressional district model for awarding electors or switched back. No states gave the legislature more power over the selection of presidential electors. I already mentioned this one earlier too, but it bears repeating. At the beginning of 2021, legislators, commentators, election officials, and other experts were all in a clamor over whether some states would repeal no excuse absentee voting. None did. And lastly, if you remember the March 2021 issue of the Canvas, as Wendy mentioned, and I'm sure you're all paying very close attention to our monthly publications, you'll see that we made these predictions about primaries and how it might be a hot topic. And it's hard to predict the future. We were wrong. No state made any significant changes to its primary type, though I will add and give us some bonus points for the fact that Nevada did change from a caucus to a presidential preference primary. That counts as one of our predictions coming true, Wendy. We'll kind of feel good about that. But if any of you have a spare crystal ball lying around, I know that we would like one. We would benefit from that. And I think with this, I will hand it back to you, Wendy.
Mandy, on the primary question, do we know something out of Maine? Did they move from where it was a closed primary to where unaffiliated voters can choose to vote in either of the major primaries? That's we can identify that.
I think so,
sure.
And I looked, but it's possible we missed it. If there's comments in the chat about
I'm thinking of our Maine person who came down to Tampa with us. But at any rate, maybe somebody, maybe Ben or Christy can figure that out.
Sure, there were definitely introductions in Maine.
Yeah. So we did have the questions that expanding access to drop boxes and providing early in-person voting tend to impose costs on counties that administer elections. Have you heard from any state policymakers that cost is an issue hampering the expansion of these particular policies? Well, the answer is yes and no. And now you're going to get to meet my cat. He's joining us today. It is absolutely true that if you have a requirement that all jurisdictions throughout a state must provide drop boxes, the money to do that has to come from somewhere. And it's absolutely true to keep polling places open for a couple of weeks in advance of election day has a cost associated with it. So that does come up. But Mandy and I have been actually kind of thinking about a rubric that could be used for any election bill that a legislator might want to introduce. And what would be the things that they would want to know? They'd want to know, does it increase or impact voter turnout? Is it specifically about voter turnout for any particular group of people? Like, for instance, we learned that mail voting is sometimes problematic on tribal lands. Is it secure is the idea that's being proposed. Is it secure? And what's the cost associated with it? So I don't think any bill should ever go forward that doesn't have kind of a price tag on it. So good question there. And then do you have any information or findings on locations for early in-person voting, the uses of voting centers or satellite voting offices? Mandy, do you want to address that?
Sure, I didn't look up that particular issue yesterday when I was kind of refining these slides, but I think there was some action related to vote centers. I know some states had kind of implemented vote center pilot programs. I want to say Kentucky, but don't quote me on that, recently, or Tennessee is what I was thinking of. And those have kind of continued to expand, even if there was no specific legislative action this year in those states. But our database has the vote centers tag, so that's easy to check.
Great. And then the question, have you noticed states passing legislation allowing state officials to pre-count, is the phrase being used here, mail-in or early ballots? And so tell us again what the news on that is.
So being able to pre-count, or we usually call it process, absentee ballots, it was also a hot topic. I am not remembering specific legislation that changed this significantly. I think a couple of states maybe pushed it back a day, giving, instead of 3 days of processing time, 4 days of processing time. But there was no real splash on this as far as I can recall, but that's something that we know might be an issue moving forward. And we can kind of go check the data again now that legislatures are pretty much done passing bills for the year. Great.
I think we may be getting close to the end, and that means it's time to come back to Heather's question. Am I missing anything before we do that? Okay, so Heather's question was about sort of the push-pull of voter turnout and security. And I guess I'd like to frame it then as it doesn't have to be a push-pull. It doesn't have to be a one versus the other. Can they both be done at the same time? And I believe that post-election audits are a good way to inspire confidence and in the election outcomes. And voter turnout does increase with same-day registration. But the real thing that motivates people to vote is not the election methodology, it's the candidates and the topics that are on the ballot. So what we get is people vote because they're motivated to vote. So if you want to increase turnout, sure, you can tweak a few things, make registration automatic, perhaps, certainly online voter registration. These were all thought to be motivators for increased turnout. But really the truth is, are the parties running candidates that are of interest. So to close out, Mandy, I thought I would ask you what your crystal ball shows us for the future, now that we've proven that we're not that good at it.
Right. Well, I don't want to necessarily predict specific policies will be hot, although it seems likely that funding, that poll watchers, that absentee mail voting, those things that have been in the news will continue to be the subjects of bills. I think what I would feel more confident predicting, and perhaps it's taking the safe way out, is that issues around and concerns around election integrity and strengthening our elections have been on everyone's mind. And so I think that motivation behind the bills that we see in legislatures will continue. But what kinds of bills that results in is going to differ based on what you think is the biggest issue with voter confidence or the biggest issue with election integrity. So I think those will still be the motivating forces, and we'll kind of have to wait and see what bills get introduced and get passed.
Well, I maybe it's like we work together, because I would have said the very same things. We're doing some group think here. So to close, I'd like to remind everybody that NCSL's mission is to strengthen state legislatures. That's it, strengthen state legislatures. And that's what Mandy and I do. That's what all of the NCSLers do around us on whatever their topic might be. So if you are a legislator or you are legislative staff, please let us know how we can serve you. And with that, I'll close with our warm wishes for you and for everyone around you as we close out this year and head into a very busy next year. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.